So we've given an overview of, it's kind of a justification of why you might be interested in hematological variables, because a really cute way of really identifying an adaptation to training without having a look at VO2 responses. And actually, it's cost effective in many ways. It's fairly cheap. The kits to record blood volumes like this sounds a lot. It's about £10,000. You want to buy an online metabolic cart, it's about 30,000. And so it's quid pro quo. The difference is here, you don't see the global picture, which is what the VO2 response gives you. This is just a straight hematological response. And in many ways, I would argue, rather than just being a piece of the jigsaw, I would argue that this is one of those little pegs on the side of the jigsaw piece. So you've kind of got to use it carefully. Oops, there we go. So if we look at this data from Sorka, and if you're interested in stuff to do with blood volumes and hematology, have a look for Sorka. Sorka is perhaps one of the most prolific publishers in this area, along with Convertino. Two big researchers in this area. And this is really just exemplifying what we've just been talking about. So the percentage change, that's the delta score on our y-axis. We've got our number of days training, and you can see blood volume, plasma volume, erythrocyte volume, and notice you get that big spike that we spoke about a moment ago in the first few days to weeks in order to allow for a reduced peripheral resistance for the blood pressure. But notice after about 20 to 30 weeks, everything settles back down. Yes, we've gained in erythrocyte volume, but we've gained, plasma volume's gone up, it's higher than it was at pre-values. So the net result will be Hematocrit score doesn't change. So that's why Hematocrit's a really useful index for us, particularly if we've got somebody who's in long-term training and Hematocrit score suddenly changes, then we have to ask ourselves why. It's not going to be because they've suddenly done a period of shock training. It's going to remain fairly constant in somebody who's been training for longer than, let's say 40 weeks. So quite a useful marker for us. The other reason, and again this is from the Sorka paper, is you can see here training duration, obviously less than or equal to 11 days, less than or equal to 21 days. But notice, let's take the VO2 max. So even in less than 11 days, you're looking at about 5% increase in VO2 max. Now, we're not specifying the kind of training here, but these are people who have never been exposed to training before. So you'd expect to see that. VO2 max is a very, very pliable parameter in the early stages of training. But notice the factor that's probably contributing to this to a certain degree is plasma volume, because that's driving up the cardiac output. Cardiac output linked to VO2 max. There's no real change in our erythrocyte volume, which we're using as our index of red blood cell count. But now, look, VO2 max has increased because we've got the increase. What would you say here about hematocrit? Thicker? Thinner? You going thicker? Everybody agree? No, much thinner, because it's the red blood cells that will give you the thickness. Remember, that's what gives it the stickiness. So it's thin because you've got plasma volume. Now we've come over here. What you've now got is a balance between hematocrit and between plasma and red blood cell count. So actually, as much as these have gone up, we've actually got now viscosity in the body is slightly thicker. It is slightly thicker. But notice that the increase in the VO2 in the red blood cell count, which we've gone up from, let's call that 10%, look at the association with VO2 max. about a 10% increase, would you agree? In VO2 max? Yeah. The two go together. If you drive red blood cell counts up by X%, you'll get a similar increase in VO2 max. If you decrease red blood cell volume, you get a similar decrease in VO2 max. Why? Why that relationship? Keep going. The higher the oxygen, the higher the VO2 max. There you go. If you increase the, so and this is important, we're assuming nothing else is changing here. So there's no caveats, there's no suddenly they got anemic or whatever. This is the assumption. If you increase red blood cell count, you're increasing the oxygen carrying capacity in the blood. VO2 max reflects your ability to use oxygen. So if you increase the oxygen carrying capacity in the blood, red blood cell count, VO2 max is going to show a VO2 max is going to show a very similar response to the red blood cell count. What happens when you try and talk? So the two are linked. Yeah, but it will increase by the same proportion. So can you see? We've gone up by about 10% in red blood cell count and 10% in VO2 max. The two go very much together. So when we took blood out of people, we got an average decrease in red blood cell count of 7.9%. VO2 max fell by about 7.2%. So the two are linked. The two are linked. So again, some quite nice data, but it just shows you the duration of training. So if we go here, we take the Holman study, 120 days of training, we've got a 6% change in blood volume, okay? But that's after 120 days training. If you go down to here, 9 days training is producing very, very similar responses. So in other words, once you've reached that point, it maintains. It's about maintaining the blood volume. The plasma volume, notice it's high, there's a slight anomaly here, and then it starts to fall. So the RCV is the reticulocyte cell volume. That's new red blood cells. Okay? And that's holding pretty much down here. In other words, you are replacing dead blood cells. You've got about 120-day life cycle. So you wouldn't expect there to be a sudden spike, particularly in the longer-term studies. Genuine data. So this is kind of... so the CSC are a professional cycling team competing in the Tour. They're competing in the Tour de France, the Giro, Tour of Spain. What you've got is they're tracking their data over this period of time. So each line represents a rider. What we've got is the average for the normal population. So this is hemoglobin. So we know that the average hemoglobin score for the population for males is 14 to 18 grams per deciliter. So males, it's about 14 to 18 grams per deciliter. Females, it's about 12 to 14 grams per deciliter. The UCI, that's the governing body for cycling, setting up a limit. And they're saying, well, if you're above that, you're probably doping. Okay, well, I'm not even going to argue the contentiousness of that. But can you see that they fluctuate, but in most cases, you could put a line of best fit through these, apart from this poor chap here, who there's something going on. It's either an anomalous test result or some kind of anemia is going on there. But if you look at most of those, can you see that they are, yeah, they're fluctuating, but you could put a line of best fit through. They're maintaining. So as much as these guys are training throughout the year, so if we go, here we go, January, and the tour would be, well, the tour would be after here, so into June, July. So it's not as though, that they're not training, they're training harder and harder. But in well-trained individuals, it's about maintenance. Yes, you get fluctuations, which are going to represent different periods of training. But can you see that if you put a trend line through, they're pretty stable, but you're seeing biological fluctuation. But it's quite fascinating how much of them, apart from these couple here, are way above the general population score. They've got a greater oxygen carrying capacity. If you've got a greater oxygen carrying capacity, you will have a much higher VO2 max. And it's not surprising that in elite cyclists, we see resting heart rates in the region of 28 beats per minute. 28. Because you've got a greater oxygen carrying capacity, you've got a greater stroke volume, so you can have less beats per heart, you can inject more blood per beat of the heart and carry more oxygen per beat of the heart. Part of that is genetic, but most of that is training adaptation. Then we take the really contentious one, Hematocrit. Hematocrit is the score that is used to really determine whether somebody is doped, and they use it a lot in cycling. And they set an upper threshold of 50%. There's your general population score, about 42%. So 43%, sorry. It's right at the lower end for the general population that we spoke about. But again, can you see that there are fluctuations, but on the whole, you can put a trend line through them. In other words, the Hematocrit score doesn't really change over the period, apart from, again, this same chap here. My gut feeling is that this is some kind of testimony more than anything else, which happens. Okay? But if you look, most of them, yellow, I think obviously something's gone on with yellow. I'll call it maybe using yellow gel, I don't know. Something's gone on with him. But most of them, they're fluctuating, but it's holding to what we were talking about earlier on. This idea that the hematocrit concentration, once it reaches its peak, you maintain that level. It's a balance then between red blood cell count and hematocrit. Now, the other reason that we're quite interested, and this is a big area that people look at these kind of values, is in relation to exposure to altitude. It's a great indication that somebody's had good altitude exposure. So, this paper, which was in the British Journal of Sports Med, we've got two groups. We've got our 5K runners, we've got our marathon runners, and they're going to expose them to 26 days of living high, training low. So I'll just explain that. Live high, train low is where you take them to altitude to live, and then in every 24-hour period, you bring them down to sea level to train. Okay? Again, we won't talk about the efficacy, but that is the best approach for using altitude. If you live high and train high, you don't get any gain in performance. The only way you get the gain in performance is living high and training low. So here we go, hemoglobin, so grams per litre, not deciliter that we saw in the other one. So that's 132 to 133. Not an enormous change. 6.3% change in blood volume, plasma volume, a 5.8% change. But don't forget, this is an acute exposure. We're seeing similar responses in the marathon runners as well. So even in well-trained athletes, it's showing you, A, that altitude works, but it's also showing you why collecting blood samples, looking at hematology, is important to understand the degree of adaptation. If you bring them back down to sea level and take away the stimulus, they will lose these within about 14 days. They'll be back to the pre-exposure levels. But it is an important tool to have. You would never take a group of athletes to altitude without recording any form of hematological variables. So when I used to travel with the endurance squad, Paralympic endurance squad, to training camps, blood screening every day. Every day. We did hydration status every day, blood screening every day, heart rate monitoring while they were training, as much as it was a little bit dodgy. Lactate recording every day. So we've got this picture. We could see the rates at which people were adapting to the training. We could see who was overloading, we could see who was underloading. And then we come to the area, I suppose, where the bloods do receive a lot of attention. And that is our identification of the anemia.